Hello and welcome back to the APUSH History Curriculum. In this set of videos, we're going to begin our look at the seventh time period covered in APUSH, which covers the years 1890 through the year 1945. Because this time period is so large, for the purposes of our class, we will be dividing it into two units, with this first unit, our Unit 8, covering 1890 to 1920. You will notice that once again, the early part of this time period overlaps with the end of the last one. So some of the information and events from the last era are also important to this one. The key concepts for the era focus on continued growth opportunities and the need for additional markets abroad, especially as there were economic uncertainties in the form of financial panics. New technologies and innovations allowed the U.S. to expand its influence well beyond its borders to areas all around the globe. In addition, the U.S. began to participate in a series of international conflicts that helped to propel the U.S. into international prominence, which in turn brings up domestic debates about what the role of the U.S. should be and how to project this Americanism onto the rest of the world. In our Unit 8, the topics we're going to be looking at include a look at the debates over imperialism, the Spanish-American War, the progressive era of reform, and the military and diplomacy of World War I and the U.S. home front. The era will continue later on to include the cultural upheaval of the 1920s, Depression, and the government's response to it in the 1930s, and then on to World War II. But we'll look at those other areas when we get to Unit 9. So in this video, we'll be looking at topic 7.2, which covers the debates about American imperialism. First, we will look at the background of the issue, and then we'll look at the arguments both for and against the U.S. becoming an imperial nation. So let's get to it. The United States had been a believer in expansion from almost its very beginning, first expanding into the unsettled areas west of the Appalachians, then into the Louisiana Purchase territory. Expansion continued with the annexation of Texas, the addition of Oregon, and the acquisition of land from Mexico as a result of the war. That was followed with more land from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase, and then finally the addition of Alaska in 1867 in what some called Seward's Folly. At least, it was called that because many thought the land had no value, at least not until gold was discovered there in 1898. But with the closing of the frontier in 1890, at least according to the U.S. Census Bureau, Americans had nowhere else to go. The supporters of American imperialism supported continuing this expansion for a variety of reasons. With America's farmers and factories producing more than the population could consume, overseas markets were necessary to keep the economy going. And since valuable resources were discovered in Alaska, there might have been other locations around the world that would provide a similar benefit, if only the U.S. possessed them. In addition, many of the European nations that the U.S. was competing with economically were undergoing a new round of imperialism themselves. So those in favor of continued expansion wanted to do the same, lest America fall behind. And of course, you still have the influence of the social Darwinists that felt if these weaker nations couldn't resist American influences, then they didn't deserve to be independent anyway. It was, after all, survival of the fittest. These imperialists were also influenced by a book published by the Reverend Josiah Strong, a Christian minister who argued that it was the Christian duty of the white race to spread religion and the values of Western civilization to the areas of the world that had not yet experienced it. And yet another book that had an influence on the imperialists was The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Alfred Thayer Mahan. It studied past empires from the colonial eras and noted that only the nations who had invested heavily in their navies became significant world powers. Countries like Germany and Britain were modernizing their navies, and the U.S. Congress, persuaded by these ideas, authorized the construction of a modern steel navy. This new navy would allow for the U.S. to spread its influence well beyond its borders. But there were also many who were opposed to the idea of imperialism. These anti-imperialists believed in the principle of self-determination, meaning they thought that the peoples should be free to govern themselves without any interference of outside nations. They pointed out the similarities of the U.S. arguments for independence during the time of the American Revolution, wanting to be free of British imperial control, because even with so much in common, Britain really just didn't understand America. And if that was true back in 1776, how could it be any less true in the 1890s? George Washington himself had even offered a warning to Americans as he had left office, urging them to avoid foreign entanglements as a means of preserving their own identity and independence. He feared that doing so would draw the U.S. into wars and conflicts that would be too costly for America. But as the U.S. did venture into becoming an imperial nation, gaining territory in the Caribbean and the Pacific, another debate emerged between the two groups as to whether or not the U.S. Constitution applied to these overseas territories. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually weighed in on the issue in the insular cases, ruling that the Constitution did not necessarily follow the flag. In other words, the full rights guaranteed by the Constitution did not apply to the overseas colonies of the United States and the people living there. Therefore, they had less rights than citizens at home. Then again, not all citizens at home enjoyed the full rights of citizenship either, something that we will explore in a future video. Well, that's about what you need to know about topic 7.2, the debates over imperialism. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.